bjóði velkomna á svið Karen Ulltveit Moe, prófessor í hagfræði við Háskólann í Oslo.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. So, I guess that the background, because I'm here, is because I chaired a committee that made a recommendation on how we should tax the aquaculture in Norway, and we delivered our recommendation now around 5 years ago. So, now we already had a really nice presentation of how things are in Norway. I think it was painted a picture that was really as if everything is great in Norway. I think I should say that I think of the story slightly different, but it's also a story which has kind of two parts. And that's what I want to take you through today. So I'm going to go very fast here because the presentation already kind of described what do we think about when you think about resource rent. So it is a type of profit that then arises after all the different factors of production, which economists calls it, capital, labor, intermediates, have got their market-based remuneration. And the reason why it then arises, it could be about natural resources, it could be about regulations, it could also be about market power and enterprise-specific knowledge and technology, which is important to be aware of, or it could be about a combination of these, which is often true. So what we know in Norway is that we have the situation that natural resources combined with regulation has given rise to pure profit resource rents, that is resource rent in the aquaculture industry, in the hydropower industry, and in the oil and gas industry. So that's kind of the backdrop here. And I'm going today to focus on the petroleum industry and on the aquaculture industry. And one of the reasons why I do not include hydropower, it's partly for time reasons, and partly because the hydropower industry is slightly different in the sense that the bulk of it is owned by the state or by municipalities. So the fact that we have a resource rent tax in that industry, it's to some extent also about internal transfers. So I think that the two other industries are more interesting to look at. So a brief history of the resource rent tax on petroleum in Norway. So Norway found oil in 1969. And in the very beginning, the taxation that was used towards industry was just the same as we had for all other companies, and it was a slight few additional taxes, but they were just minor. It was type of fees, royalties. But in the wake of increasing petroleum prices, the government of Prime Minister Bradley decided that we need to introduce a resource rent tax on petroleum income, and the motivation was very clear. It was, and I'm citing for a proposal that then went to the parliament, namely that a greater share of the petroleum income should accrue to the public. It should be said that the Prime Minister and his government was very well helped by really good civil servants in the Ministry of Finance and in the Ministry of Energy, which then designed how the tax should be set up, which was kind of impressive, because at that point, it was really not many places to look to. And it was designed as a profit-based resource tax, which meant that the state carried or got a fair bit of the upside, but of course also had to share investments and costs. And it's today then altogether around 78%. So when I say 78%, that includes also the corporate tax rate that the industry then has to pay. again, the argument that was put forward to justify the tax is that, apart from kind of the motivation, that is the way we have organized natural resources in Norway, which means that the bulk of them are actually owned by the state. Then the fact that the petroleum income then arises from these natural resources, which are owned by the state, also means that it's natural that the profit is also shared with the owners, namely the big V, the public. So I'm going to present quite a few figures during this presentation. I don't have time, and it's not important that you kind of look at each of them. They are mainly meant for illustration. So the thing that I want to kind of you to take away from this one is simply that Norway has, petroleum has been very important for the Norwegian economy, when we look at exports, investments, GDP, and so on. But it has also been extremely important for the state finances. Today, just a couple of weeks ago, we had the fiscal budget for 2025. Almost 25% of that fiscal budget is now paid for by the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which has been set up based on the income from the petroleum tax and the direct ownership of the state in the petroleum sector. So, and 25% of the fiscal budget is quite a bit. But it's one thing which is important to note. So this here tells you how the tax revenues and in some the state's revenues from the petroleum sector has evolved over time. What I want you to pay attention to is that at the beginning, it wasn't actually that much. And it reflected that it was a building up phase where lots of resources went into simply investing and setting up the industry. So this is about being patient. So when you kind of introduce a type of resource rent tax based on profits, and you share both profits and cost and investment, yes, then you're in also for the period where there are not that high income. But later on, the income became substantial. What has characterized the resource rent taxation in systems in Norway, I would say up until recently, and when we started to then debate whether we should have that also for the agriculture industry, was that there has been broad consensus and high legitimacy across political lines. It has been very much the view that it's a tax that it's fair. It has high legitimacy. And the reason for that is simply because then the origin of the income is resources that belong to the Norwegian society. The other thing is exactly that there has been a broad consensus. This principle that the public shall have a stake in the returns that comes from the exploitation of public resources has had broad political support across all parties since then 1975, which is actually quite astonishing. It has meant that these considerable returns that we have had from natural resources related to then petroleum and also hydropower have been then shared very differently in Norway than in many other countries. So what we typically see in many other countries are that these returns do not result in a permanent increase in welfare, but are rather concentrated in smaller groups in society. And there is no doubt that our way of taxing resource rents has been essential for how our welfare state has developed, as it has allowed for investments in infrastructure, public welfare schemes, and also allowed for high household income growth. And of course, and it has allowed for the oil fund, which the Overseveran Oil Fund, which of course is then the mechanism that allows us to then take the petroleum tax income and into the Norwegian society on an annual basis. But then there is this other tail. So what I mainly want you to take away from this is that, the numbers here can be a bit confusing. On the right axis, that's where I draw the resource rent that accrues to the oil and gas. And if you look at the numbers, you see that everything that has to do with oil and gas is enormous compared to what is the case in the hydropower and in the aquaculture industry. So this here is an illustration of resource rents. The key message here is that what we realized was that around 2012, the resource rent related to the aquaculture that had used to be just very volatile, very low, had actually surpassed the resource rent in the hydropower industry. And the idea that, all right, there is this industry that it's starting to create substantial resource rent began to kind of get attention about in the public, among all politicians, and in the Ministry of Finance. And what had happened? So what had happened in the Norwegian agricultural industry was that it went from being a tiny, tiny industry with tiny, tiny firms. And I think it's kind of telling that at the beginning, each person could only have, according to the law, each person could only have one license in this industry. So, but it had gone from being a rural activity to be a global industry with an enormous amount of tons being produced and sold. And that's another way of just showing that is that, these are different stock market indices. What I want you to look at is the green one, which is the aquaculture one, and it compared to the yellow one, which is the general stock market index for the Oslo Stock Exchange. So it went from being just like all other industries, but then to just take off and have an enormous profitability. And the flip side of this is that it was an industry that went from having all these tiny firms to just having a few. And that was due to deregulation that then was allowed for in the 1990s, where we went from having then an industry with tiny firms, lots of trouble with both profitability and growth, to now having much fewer firms, but also with more than a majority of the licenses now being controlled by just a handful of ownership structures. And this is also, so the green ones shows you what is aquaculture, and the red one is the manufacturing industry. The key thing to take away here is that returns on capital, operating margins have just been enormous in the aquaculture industry if we compare it to the manufacturing industry. Why am I showing you this? So this was important for our recommendation because it's also another way of illustrating that there is something special in this industry, which is not only about technology and so on, it's something about that natural resources and regulation is creating this resource rent. And that shows up in extraordinary returns on capital. So, but the thing was that the agriculture industry in Norway is regulated based on time unlimited aquaculture licenses that have been allocated then from the 60s. And the thing is that 97% of these unlimited licenses, they had been awarded for free. And so this figure then shows you kind of the timeline here. And then at around around 2014, we started to have more proper auctions. Up until then, they were either awarded for free or for a fee that was considerable below what would the real market auction would have given. So the calculations that the committee that I was on gave was that the total value of these licenses would be around 200 billion Norwegian kroner. And that's based on different, you could calculate it in different ways. We actually got the same results regardless of how we do it. So 200 billion kroner, that's around then approximately $20 billion. So it's quite a lot. For those values, the industry had in total paid something like 7 billion kroner. That means 3% of the estimated value. This was very important for the recommendation that we then made. So we made a recommendation about introducing a resource rent tax. When you do that, you can do that in 3 ways, in a way. You can either go for what we already had on petroleum, which is a profit-based tax. The good thing about those kind of taxes is that they depend on the profitability, and that means that they will be robust towards technological changes and changing market conditions. And we know that natural resource industries, they are typically very volatile, and therefore it also makes sense to have a tax, a resource rent tax, that in a way takes that into account by taxing profitability and not gross production, which would also be an alternative. And if I may say, I know that you have a small gross production tax here. That's also what they have in the Faroe Islands. The problem with that is that that may typically, especially if it's big, have an inferior impact on investment and employment. Because if it's big enough, that type of tax may turn an investment that would be profitable without taxes into something that is not profitable with taxes. That we don't want. At least that's what economists don't want. A last alternative is also auctions. In Norway, we now have a combination of auctions and natural and a profit-based resource rent taxation. That's what we have in the agriculture industry. In the petroleum industry, we do not have auctions. So auctions may work if there is sufficient competition in the industry. That's definitely not the case in the Norwegian aquaculture industry, and I don't think it's the case in many other, when I look to other countries that have aquaculture industry. And if the competition is not good enough, then the revenue that comes in with these auctions simply does not reflect the underlying values. And of course, one problem with just having auctions is that in the Norwegian case, that would allow us to get rents from new licenses going forward, but not from already allocated licenses. So if you have lots of licenses that have been allocated, the only way to then actually get the income related to them is by then having a tax and not place everything on auctions. So the majority of the Aquaculture Tax Commission that I was chairing recommended that a resource rent tax was justified and should be introduced. And the backdrop was very much that up until that point, when we delivered in 2019, 97% of the licenses had not been paid for to the state. We repeated what had also been said with the petroleum tax, that it's a type of tax that promotes a growth-friendly tax system. And that is really important. So I mentioned already that it's robust towards changes in technology and competition, and that it means that products that are profitable before tax will also be profitable after tax. But it's also important because this is a type of tax that may typically also reduce the need for other type of taxes that are more distortionary and less efficient. And it's, again, important to reflect on the fact that international tax competition means that there are many taxes that become more difficult to introduce and maintain without doing harm. Resources, they are immobile, unlike all other, unlike capital. And therefore, it's a particularly efficient way of setting up a tax system. What was also important in what we proposed was that the structure that we proposed and which has been adopted is that there is, I'm not going to go into the details, but there is a structure here that allows for a split so that part of the revenues also go directly to the municipalities that actually have aquaculture located in the municipalities, which then is important because it creates an incentive to allow for increase in area allocated to aquaculture in the relevant areas. And the exact structure that we set up is more or so that it's the state that then ends up carrying the risk when it comes to the volatility in the tax income, while stable income is secured for the municipalities. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. I want to add one thing, which is an important characteristic of our system, namely that the resource rent tax that is now introduced for the aquaculture sector, in line with what our commission proposed, it's limited to the activity that happens in the sea. And that's important, because it's when the fish is in the sea that the company are actually exploiting the public's resources. So that means that any type of, say, processing activity that happens after the fish has been brought out of the sea, it's not subject to the additional resource rent tax. So, all right, we delivered in 2019. Already half a year before we delivered, a strong lobby activity has started. It was lots of debate, and the aquaculture industry was very successful in making sure that our recommendation was not followed for the first couple of years. But you need to be patient. I should say that I have been chairing quite a few public commissions, so I learned a lesson that normally as an economist, when you come up with a proposal, you would like it to see it introduced immediately. That doesn't always work. In this case, it took 3 years, but after 3 years, a new government came around and introduced made a proposal to the parliament to introduce a tax that reflected what we had suggested. Again, more debate, but in May 2023, the Norwegian Parliament then adopted a profit-based resource rent tax on aquaculture. Somehow less than we had proposed, but I should say that in the meantime, taxes on capital income and gain and wealth has increased, so it did make sense to kind of look at the big picture here. I think there is one important lesson to be learned here from Norway, and that is that about the timing for when you introduce a resource rent tax. The petroleum tax was a type of success history, and I think an important reason why was that it was introduced very early, just 6 years after we had found oil. And the state did indeed share risks related to investments and costs in the coming year, which is also reflected in lower tax income. And of course, it is a risk that when you introduce it early, you may also give the companies an incentive to take too much risk. But at the same time, if you are too late, and I think I'm going to argue that we were too late when it comes to the aquaculture industry, then there will be strong lobbying and also a perception that in a way it's less fair, it's less legitimate, in the sense that the state comes in after lots of investment have been made, without then sharing also the cost of building it up. So we can't have it both ways. Somehow you can't, but you need to try, as policymakers, you want to try to strike the balance between not too early and not too late when you introduce these type of taxations. And I think with those words, I'm going to end. Thank you very much.
Bjóðu velkominn á svið Guðmund Gunnarsson. Hann ræðir við Karen auðlindagjöld.
Yes. So thank you very much, Karen. It was very informative. So now what happens now is that we have about 18 minutes until coffee break. And since the labor union thought that since we have a full room of smart people and a respected professor, it would be nice to get someone not very smart to ask the stupid questions. And I dribbled down a lot. I want to take you back to the first part regarding the oil industry. And I'm particularly interested because you said that the main clue or sort of the reason behind the success story is that you implemented the resource rental tax early on. But there was still resistance, right? Like we talked about before you came on, mainly from the companies, right?
Yes, it was a big resistance also at that point. And at that point, those that were operating at the Norwegian offshore sector were then more or less only US companies. And they were very forceful. They said that if you introduce this tax, we regard it as retroactive. We are going to leave Norway. We are not interested in producing oil here anymore. And we will also take the Norwegian state to court. And so it was a fuss. But I think what helped at that point was that it was a very broad political consensus. And it might also have helped that these were a group of foreigners. They were based in Stavanger, but they didn't have the support of many local communities around the coast. So I think they had a harder time convincing people that it was not a good idea to introduce this tax. So, and it was forceful politicians that also agreed that this made sense. And it was very good civil servants that also knew what they were doing. So it was a very well-prepared proposal that went to the parliament, where also the Ministry of Law had, and Justice had simply gone through the arguments that were made up front from the companies, and more or less argued that none of them made sense, if I may put it a bit simple. For instance, arguing that no, there were no agreements. And so one point was, for instance, that as they had then got the licenses to extract oil, there were no agreements there saying that they would never be taxed. So it didn't. So the state was not obliged to never change any of the regulation then facing the industry.
Yeah, and because we are reflecting this on maybe natural resource-based country like Iceland compared to Norway, I think we can all sort of, I think we're familiar with these threats of companies saying we will leave if you tax us. I think that's not a Norwegian thing or a US thing.
No, it's normally not. Can
you take us a little bit on layman terms because we are talking about this resource rental tax, and you sort of argue and advocate that it's a good type of tax and different maybe from traditional, because we always have this debate when we talk about taxation. You have political parties that are pro-taxes or against taxes. You should lower taxes or raise them. But take us a little bit on sort of, for a relatively stupid guy, what is the benefit of a resource rental tax for a government or for a state?
So the thing is, as economists, the way we think about taxes is that taxes are, okay, we need taxes to fund public services, healthcare, and so on. But at the same time, taxes, it's a bit difficult because taxes may also be harmful. They distort activity, they reduce investment, and so on. So we really want to use taxes that are as least harmful as possible. So we have kind of like a pecking order of taxes. And essential is that if something is immobile, it's something that we like to, that's a good tax object. Because but if it's mobile, say a company or just capital, then if you tax it, say, much more than others, then it may just flee and go somewhere else. The beauty with taxing then natural resources is that they don't move.
Natural resources tend to stay.
So irrespective of whether you, so therefore it's a good tax object, and so say that, so you rather want to kind of exploit that tax base and instead reduce your tax on capital if you don't. So say that your point of departure is that no, you don't want increased taxes. You don't want increased taxes, tax revenues. You rather want to kind of keep the size of the public sector down. Then you still want to kind of do like a tax exchange and then introduce a tax on natural resources and then take down the tax on capital. That's going to be better for the economy as in total. It's going to allow for more value to be created.
And because it's a tax on, if you can use that term, like excess profit,
yes,
it's a shared responsibility of the general public or the state.
Yes, that's also, yes, and that's of course, and that's again then an important feature of the tax that it's or of the type of resource rent taxes that we have in Norway. That it's also important that it has these nice features as long as you make it profit-based.
Right.
If you turn to the type of tax that is commonly used, namely when it comes to resource rent in other countries, namely that you put something like you put a tax on the gross revenue, then you may also have distortive effects that are also harmful.
For the
economy, for the industry and for the economy in total.
Okay.
So.
And you talked about that this is like has.
So I should say, so it's a combination of taxing natural resources and the way you tax them, which is important.
Yeah. But you said that this has built like a foundation for the welfare system, if we simplify things, in Norway. Can you contemplate that if you would not have done this in the oil industry right in the beginning, what would things look like, for example, in rural Norway, or what would it mean for the welfare system? I know it's a hypothetical question.
That's almost impossible to answer, and it should also be said that. I
told you they would be stupid questions.
Yes. Okay, but the thing is that it's. Well, yeah, I should also warn that, right? Okay, all countries are different. In Norway, at least it's very clear that there is a potential resource rent tax. There are potential resource rent tax revenues related to the agriculture, but they will never ever be able to compare with what we have from the petroleum industry because it's simply much more valuable. Yeah. So, and volume, it's not only and that matters.
Yeah, you know you're envied around the world for it.
Yes, I know. It's, but so it's so what we have now introduced for the aquaculture industry is never ever going to match what we kind of got from the petroleum industry. But I still think that the principle is very important because Norway is like Iceland. It's a small economy with lots of natural resources, and what we introduced in the 70s was not only about one industry, it was about a principle
for natural resources.
For natural resources. Yeah. And now there is now we have it's about wind power, at land, at sea. It's about metals. There will be new industries coming along in the type of natural resource-rich economies that we are. And therefore, I think one of the reasons why I felt very strongly about this was that I felt that we had succeeded in establishing a very important principle in the 70s, namely that income related to natural resources it's great that they are extracted, but the income should be shared with the public. And if we hadn't introduced it now for the aquaculture industry, we would have deviated from that, and then we would probably have continued to deviate from that in the future.
Yeah. So you're clever enough to make like a principle and a consensus about how you go about natural resources in this sense, and that has sort of helped you with other industries along the way.
Yes, but it should be said that it was broad consensus in the 70s. With agriculture, it was a fight. And
even though you had like this long history of doing it.
Yes, even though. But
so you had a lot of resistance when you tried to do the same for the agriculture.
Yes, and I think that was very much about then these strong lobby groups that were then spotted around the Norwegian coast. And of course, I should say, so I have been to Hitra and Freya, where there are big fish farming establishments, and it's very impressive what they have created. I'm full of respect, and the people that are the owners in this industry, they have been great when it comes to contributing at the local level. So I very much understand that people feel also a need to then support them, because they have been giving to schools, to football teams, doing all the good things.
Creating jobs.
Yes, and primarily creating jobs, and that's great. And that is really great, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't also pay resource rent taxes. But it was a fight, and I think when you look at the numbers, it's not unlikely that we will have a change of government next year. In that case, I think there may be a new debate.
God help you. We are in the middle of that process right now.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
But that's too early to say.
Why do you think this?
But I should say one thing, and that is, despite lots of fight between politicians on this tax, what I found very interesting was that the public, and now if we abstract from the municipalities that were exactly affected, then the broad consensus in the public was that this is a tax, the agricultural tax is a tax that makes sense. All the editorials in the big Norwegian newspaper came out very favorable when we delivered our report.
The media was positive.
The media was very positive, and it's the only type of work I engaged in where I tend to say that which I find is a bit fascinating, that I meet people in the supermarket, people in the theater, people I have never met and I don't know their names, who tell me that they very much support this tax. They find that it's simply fair that they have to share their returns. And that has kind of made an impression on me, because as a professor at university, normally I don't get that type of response.
Really? But I think if we try to reflect on the Icelandic environment, and you said there are a lot of similarities between our nations regarding natural resources, we have a really, really heated debate every time we talk about how we go about our natural resources. Are we protecting them enough? Are we being respectful? What should the rental be? What should be left with the public? What should we get out of the natural resources? Can you understand how strong the lobbyism every time we talk about how much the company should pay to the people that own the natural resources? Or is it favorable in Norway because you started so early with the rental fee? Or are we getting more heated lobbyism, heated discussions here because we have decided to go a different route?
I think there is a political economy here part here, which is simply so that the more an industry grows, the stronger it will, in a way, protect its rights. So, and the more lobbying you get. And in a way, that's kind of natural. I guess that none of us really like paying taxes. It's not so that...
Very true.
Right. It's not so that we call in to the tax authorities and say that...
Can I pay more?
Yes, can I pay more?
I've never made that call.
No, right? I think none of us, even though I think that tax is really needed. It's something that we really like, but we seldom like paying them. And I think, and that's a bit natural. But I think that then understanding that in some areas where if it really makes sense to have taxes in some areas, it just gets more difficult if you wait for long. And it also gets, so one of the arguments that was made in Norway by the fish farmers, which is a very valid argument, is that, so the state has been sitting around for like 20 years, watching us kind of struggling, watching us go bust. And now, when we are really starting to kind of make revenue, then you come along and say that you want to have your share. Mm-hmm. That's not fair. Mm-hmm. And I think, and that's a valid argument.
It's exactly the same in Iceland.
So, but therefore, and with that argument, I would say the legitimacy of that argument just gets stronger the more you wait. Mm-hmm. Of course, if you introduce it fairly on, it's also easier to then, in a way, compensate firms for their investments. But if when you wait for kind of like 40 years, it's no way that you can practically set up a tax system that actually can account for this in a proper way. Okay. It becomes less perfect.
Yeah, I'm sort of halfway through like the first page. I have like a lot left, but we have a few minutes until coffee break. Maybe I want to conclude with this. Because we are trying to look at this as an example or an idea of how we might get to a consensus where the companies, the public, and everyone involved would sort of reach an agreement of a shared responsibility through taxation. What would be your message to us? Because we can hear what you're saying regarding how you've built up, if we take, for example, aquaculture, and it's exactly the same here. It started with a struggle. With a few or maybe many small companies struggling, going bust, and then it sort of boomed, and we realized that we didn't have any framework, or we hadn't given it attention. And now we are trying to build a structure around an industry after it has blossomed. What would be your recommendation? Because I know you went through like a circus of media when you came with a proposal of how you wanted to do the same taxing system you used for the oil. Can you give us like, how can you go about it without killing each other?
I don't really think I have a good answer there. But I think it's, but I would say that it is important that, which it is actually with all major tax reforms, to try to get political consensus. Because what you really don't want is unpredictability. So you want a predictable, stable tax system that is key to the business sector's development and also to all industries. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, you want to kind of sit down and work together. And
listen.
Then, yes, and listen and try to kind of make it based on consensus. And I think it's important to have in mind that also the fish farming industry also encounters quite a few challenges. Mm-hmm. And I think, and on the industry side, I think it's important to then have in mind that in order to maintain a common support for its activities, for its expansion, then it makes sense to play along with the rest of the society. Mm-hmm. Because that's, of course, if you don't, because that was also what we started to see some places, that municipalities were simply not that eager to allow for more expansion because they felt that they didn't really get any revenue out of it.
Yeah, didn't get their share.
No, so it's so there has to be kind of there has to be sharing. There has to be sharing between the companies, between their workers, between the municipalities, and between the state.
Sharing is caring, guys.
Yes.
We have some influential politicians here in the room. So are you taking notes, guys? Good. Okay, Karen, it was very useful. I think this is very good for us to reflect on how we want to go about not killing each other here in Iceland. So thank you very much.
Cool.